I'm going to give you a very brief introduction of the structure of the trip. We went with overseas adventure travel to Southern Africa. And the general structure of the trip was we spent about 2.5 days in Hwange National Park in Zimbabwe. Linda is going to elaborate on that. And Kafue National Park in Zambia, and that's my part. We spent 2 days in Chobe National Park in Botswana, which Albert is going to talk about, followed by 3 days in the Okavango Delta in Botswana. The regular trip ended at Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, but we extended our trip by going to Cape Town, South Africa, and the Cape of Good Hope. And we'll go into those places in more detail individually when we come up. I want to let you know that at the end of this talk, there will be some extremely light refreshments in the back of the room, which we hauled from Africa. So, our group of 15 stayed in surprisingly refined tented camps during most of the trip. Each couple or each individual traveler had a large private tent, about 200 to 300 square feet, with an inside bathroom with running water. They all had potable water in them. They were not climate controlled, and it was extremely hot. It would cool down during the night. It was cool in the morning, but when we went to bed at night, it was very hot. All the cabins had balconies or porches, which we were warned not to go out on after dark because the animals do not respect camp boundaries. Reese Hedges decided that they were immortal and did it anyway, but the Bork stayed inside at night. So, most days we were awakened by the guides who came outside our tents and hollered happy morning or something along those lines. They had to get up around 4:30 every day to get things going for us to get our breakfast ready, because we would leave on around a 4-hour game drive pretty early, 8 o'clock in the morning. We'd come back to the camp for lunch. Then we'd have a couple of hours to relax, and then we'd go on another game drive in the afternoon, about another 3-hour game drive, because that's when the animals are changing shifts. The daytime animals are going into sleep, and the nighttime animals are going out to kill things. So, our guides, who were all wonderful, at dinner time would explain the plan for the next day, and then they'd explain it again, and then 2 or 3 more times, always for the same 2 people who could never seem to get it right. So,
none of us.
We were perfect in every way. The guides were extremely grateful to us for being there because COVID hit them very hard. Many of them lost their homes, they lost their jobs. These are apparently pretty good paying jobs, and so they go through a pretty rigorous training program and are paid pretty well by African standards. So when tourists stopped going because of COVID, the last guide we had, the guy in Cape Town, he lost his home. And he was working, I can't forget what he was doing, but it was something extremely menial. He was very grateful to have us back. So we were, I already told you that part, I'm going to tell you that again. When we go out on our evening game drives, the guides would take alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages and a variety of snacks, and just about sundown, they would open the back of the vehicle, set everything out, and we would imbibe and ingest whatever we wanted and watch the sun go down. And the sunsets in Africa are spectacular, at least in the part of Africa we were in, primarily because the Chinese have a great many coal-fired plants there, and there's not very much, nothing really to keep the stuff from going into the air, but the sunsets are, wow, they're just great. So I'm going to just flip through a few slides of those general things, and then I'm going to start on my other one. So there we were. Those are the 5 countries we were in. That's our route, basically. That's our group and our guides, some of our guides. We got different guides in every country. Those are the modes of transportation, except I did not put a bus in there. Those were our safari vehicles. So there were 3 rows of 3 seats, sort of tiered. And they made us, every day we had to switch vehicles because they were trying to prevent the creation of cliques. So you wouldn't always sit with the same people. It didn't work very well, mostly because there were some people you just didn't want to sit with, and so you did everything you could think of not to get on there. I'm not going to name any names, Louise. Yeah, that's kind of an airboat thing, and then those are the planes that when we had the longer trips, we flew in those little 12-seaters, Cessna kind of things. Those are samples of the tented camps we stayed in. The one in the Zimbabwe one was our first one. That little one had a wonderful balcony facing out over a big valley where elephants and stuff would wander at night. Now I'm just going to go into Zimbabwe.
Actually, I am.
Linda's going into Zimbabwe, and I'm going to leave it right there for you. I was first, but then I realized I really wasn't first, so I changed the whole thing, and I forgot I did it.
So here we are in Zimbabwe. We actually flew from the US from Newark into Johannesburg. So our first flight was into Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe. And in Zimbabwe, we also visited Hwange National Park. So these are coming up. Our first impression of Zimbabwe was at the International Airport in Victoria Falls, this wonderfully modern facility, which later we learned had been renovated a few years ago by the Chinese to sort of triple the passenger flow. So we boarded a bus along with our trip experience leader, Manu, whose photo you saw in Kathy's section, and started driving on the only paved road in Zimbabwe, which happens to be a toll road, but it was also full of potholes, so I would say it was a partially paved toll road. And we had maybe an 1.5 to 2-hour drive to get up to the national park, or out to the national park, Hwange. En route, we saw a lot of coal-fired electrical generating plants, owned by the Chinese, as Kathy mentioned. So honestly, lots of pollution, which causes problems for the ecosystem and for the people who live in Zimbabwe, but that was our first reality check. So that was not exactly pleasant, and I'm wondering, what are we getting ourselves into here? But soon we were in the park and met these wonderful humans, our guides. Manu was our trip experience leader. He was with us through all 5 countries we visited. And at Hwange, we also met these 2 charming men, Douglas and Arthur. Douglas here is talking about elephant ivory with Kathy, and Arthur had this thing for elephant dung, as you see in the final photo there. Elephant dung, of all things, will unite this talk. Elephant dung runs among the 4 of us and through these 5 countries, so you'll be hearing more about elephant dung later. But he's sniffing the smoke from a lit piece of elephant dung to help his sinuses. So medicinal purpose use of elephant dung. And there in the center you see he's with a firearm, and that's because in Zimbabwe, tour guides are required by law to carry a firearm when they are out with their clients. And this applied to us walking to our tents at night from the dining hall. And when we were out in the field, we were not far in this photo from our safari vehicle. We were at a termite mound talking about termites, but Arthur had to have his weapon along. Luckily, it wasn't needed. So elephants are very, very prevalent at Hwange. In fact, the park is known for its huge concentration of elephants. Zimbabwe has about 100,000 individuals by rough estimate, and the park, Hwange, has perhaps half that number, so between 30 and 50,000 somewhere. Lots of elephants. The park is huge, however. It's just shy of 5,700 square miles, so gigantic park. This water source that you see here, really important. We visited during the dry season, towards the end of the dry season, so water was very important. The park was created in 1930 with no surface water at all. So there are something like 120, they call them drill holes, we would call them wells, that provides water, and the water is moved around by a solar pump system. Elephants are known to be really intelligent beings, and they have emotion, they show compassion, they show empathy, they help one another, and they communicate. Their communication system is not well known, but our guides assured us these two individuals with that trunk position, they know what they're saying to each other. We may not know, but they know. That wasn't just random, and it was really beautiful to watch. So we were really excited to see all these elephants by day, but the real excitement came by night, when right outside our tent, we have this thin wall of canvas, and outside our tent we heard lions roaring. And it was pretty exciting, and sure enough, the next day, our guides were able to follow the lion tracks, and they found this very cooperative but exhausted male sleeping behind a termite mound. So we were able to, in our safari vehicle, get this close to him. This is not a retouched photo. We're really that close to the lion. And the animals do not sense danger from the safari vehicles. They sense this big thing that they see every day and that never hurts them. They don't equate that big vehicle to the humans who are inside. So that's why the safari vehicle allows people to approach animals really closely. And this was just a stunning individual. There are between 500 and 700 lions at Hwanghae National Park. It's part of a connected series of reserves, private and public lands that help protect animals, including lions. So a fairly good number. We saw a total of 4 lions there. This individual, and then a younger male with 2 females they were not approachable, but this guy was. Another favorite of mine is wildebeest, and I didn't realize this before I got to Africa, but it's actually an antelope. It looks it is bovine because antelopes are in that family, so the same animal family as goats and cows, antelope. These are true African antelope, by the way, not our pronghorn, but that's a whole nother story. But a group of wildebeest is called a herd or an incongruity. Can you imagine an incongruity of wildebeest? But that's in fact what they are. And I'm sad to say the only leopard of our entire trip was this leopard tortoise. I don't even know if you can see it in that first photo, the smaller photo. It's really so well camouflaged. And we're driving along in the safari vehicle when our guide suddenly slams on the brakes and backs up. He spotted this thing. This is how good the guides were. They were the most eagle-eyed humans I had ever met. And so this was a really nice find. I'm going to back up a second here. In that second photo, it doesn't show up real well, but the plates that make up the shell of the turtle have ridges. And those ridges act like tree rings. So you can look at an individual and tell how many years old it is, because each growing season adds another ring, if you will, another ridge to that scoot, as it's called. So this individual, I counted up, I zoomed in and counted up, and it's probably 25-ish years old, if my counting was correct, and they can live to be up to 100 years old. Tortoises are very long-lived. And if you know me, and most of you do, many of you do, I love birds, I love to bird watch, and that was the case in Africa. I drove our guides and these 3 people nuts with my concept. What's that? Because all these birds were new to me. But the first one here is a greater blue-eared starling. And we think of starlings as being kind of little, nuisance birds here, but in Africa there are many species, all really beautiful, brightly colored. And then the lilac-breasted roller. 8 colors on this bird. They were common and easy to see, and the term roller is because of their somersaulting behavior when they are in their mating rituals. So 2 favorites there. Another favorite, the Kori bustard. This bird is the largest flighted bird in Africa. It's not as big as an ostrich, which does not fly. But
Technically, it's the heaviest.
It's 40 pounds. It's a 40-pound bird, and it stands up to 4.5 feet tall. And you have to envision this individual with its tail spread out like a turkey and its crest raised. We got to watch them doing their mating behavior.
Is that
So-
also known as secretary bird?
You know, when we first saw these birds, we all, I think in unison said, "Secretary bird!" But no, they're actually different. And we did not see secretary birds when we were there. They're very similar. But yeah, Cory Bustard was new to me and just a real favorite. These guys were really strange. We saw probably 5 species of hornbills in Africa, and this is the southern ground hornbill. It's just a strange looking bird, but also beautiful at the same time, I think, and it's the stuff of legend. The folklore says that people who see these birds will die, and their families will die, and great calamity will happen. A black bird with the red and the white wing, it just kind of looks that way. So they were actually quite despised in Zimbabwe for a long time, but now they're protected and folks no border. But we did mind our P's and Q's for a while after seeing the southern ground hornbill. Really enjoyed. What's that?
How many bird species?
Oh, thank you. I actually looked that up today. In Zimbabwe, I saw 62 bird species. Almost all of them were new to me. And on the trip, as a whole, 174 species, which is not too bad since it wasn't a birding trip per se. But I bird watch wherever I am. So anyway, it was great. Just wonderful birds. And really enjoyed our time at Hwange, viewing animals. This is Bev looking at some kudu. We saw 14 species of antelope, by the way, on our trip, and you'll see some more later. The center photo, there's a tiny, tiny little black-backed jackal at the base of this tree, and then also the final shot there just commemorates our evening sundowners and game drives with Manu and Douglas, and just the beautiful African landscape. It was dry season, but still beautiful in its own way, for sure. So overseas adventure travel likes to meld the natural world with culture and societal issues as well. And so along those lines, when we left Hwange and drove back towards Victoria Falls, we stopped just outside of Victoria Falls at Jubilani Village. And we were given money by OAT and asked to go in and shop at this and a couple of stores next door. Before we went to the homestead village, we bought some commodities to share with the villagers. So we bought products like eggs. Here's Albert, our linguist, buying eggs. We also bought things like flour and beans and polenta and bread, just basic commodities, cooking oil, butter. We had to do this in the local dialect. So English is the official language in Zimbabwe, but there are local dialects. But we had our cheat sheets. We were phonetically trying to pronounce these things. And it was great because we got to interact with and laugh with the local folks. So at the actual homestead village, we got to see what daily life is like in rural Zimbabwe. It's a big compound, a big open lot with individual huts that serve as various rooms that we would find in a house. So there were chickens running around and goats. These women here in the first photo are pounding sorghum into feed for the chickens. Then this woman next to her in the next shot is making polenta over an open fire in one of the huts. And polenta, corn grits, if you will, is a staple food in Africa, in Zimbabwe in particular. They call it mealie meal, but it's present at pretty much every meal. And then the huts I mentioned are made of mud. These two young ladies are using dirt that they collected from termite mounds mixed with water and making them into these cylindrical blocks that are used to make the walls of the huts. So termite mounds can get to be many feet tall, but they're a nice, easy, already broken up source of soil, and so the native folks make use of that when they make their mud bricks. And then finally, this is an example of the nicest room in the compound, which is where everything important happens. Births and deaths and marriage proposals. You'll be hearing more about the whole system, dowry system in Africa. a little bit later. But the nicest dishes go there, and it's a special room in the house for sure. So really fun to see the way rural Zimbabweans live. We weren't expecting Mopani worms, but we got Mopani worms. Our guides were talking about termite season. They love eating termites, which taste like bacon. And we missed termite season, but we got in on Mopani worms, which are caterpillars that are dried and then pan-fried along with onions and tomatoes. And I have to say they are delicious. Albert chose like the biggest, fattest one. And as you can see, he popped it in his mouth. I went for a small one. But the main, I think, I was so shocked that Albert did this, not because it was a worm, but because he hates onions, and these were cooked with onions. But he did it, and I'm so proud of him.
There were no onions on it.
I had a big onion and a big tomato to get mine down, to tell you the truth, but it really was tasty. So later, this other slide isn't popping up there. I was hoping to show you a slide of big barrels of dried Mopani worms at a market that we saw in Zambia, but that seems to have flown the coop. Let me go this way. Oh, there it is. Sorry, it was operator error. So here is Albert, yet again my favorite topic of photography, with a big barrel of dried Mopani worms at an outdoor market. Just perusing them. So just a natural history interlude here. The Mopani worm is a caterpillar that ultimately becomes a species of emperor moth. And they feed on the Mopani tree, which is a legume. And so women and girls primarily harvest these caterpillars out in the wild. So they take the caterpillar, they squeeze it like a tube of toothpaste, and out comes all the green goo. And then they are boiled in heavily salted water and sun-dried. So then they're either eaten as snacks, a nice little crispy snack, or reconstituted and pan-fried with onions and tomatoes. So that's the story of the Mopani worm. They are incredibly high in protein. They have 3 times the protein of beef. So they're really an important food source in Africa. And they're quite prized, and you can buy them on Etsy if you're so inclined. You can buy little packages. So while we were in the Jabulani area, Jabulani, I always say that wrong, we visited the primary school, which the philanthropic arm of Overseas Adventure Travel supports. So it's called Golden Circle Foundation, and they have done so much to help this little school. The woman here is the principal, and she started the school 15 years ago under a shade tree. Literally, eventually had 1 classroom, which grew to 3 classrooms with 150 students, so 50 kids crammed in each classroom. No toilet facilities. So OAT, or Golden Circle Foundation, adopted this school as a project. There are now 7 classrooms, there are 7 grades, they have toilet facilities, they have books, they have other supplies that they need. So we were really fortunate to get to go and see these school kids. They sang for us, it made me cry. And the 7th graders gave us a tour of the school. And so, you know, happy kids, very, very poor, happy kids. And in some way, little con artists too, but that's another story. No, they were just lovely, and so happy to support this project. School teachers make $45 a month, and tuition is $30 a month, which is just a huge hardship on some of these families. So, yeah, we are happy that Overseas Adventure Travel helps support them in some way. Towards the end of our trip, this is not in chronological order, but in Zimbabwe, we did visit Victoria Falls, the falls, not just the city. And we're lucky enough to get there in the afternoon when the light was such that we had these rainbows everywhere. Really misty and moist and humid, which was really nice considering it was dry season. So Victoria Falls is twice the height of Niagara Falls, but much longer. It's well over a mile long, the falls themselves. Our guide said, you know, you can't time your visit to Victoria Falls and make yourself happy. You either want more water or less water. But some of the areas where we walked, we could not have traversed had it been wet season. So we were really happy to see the falls as we did. You can't get a good photo to show the immensity of the falls unless you're in a helicopter, so you'll have to use your imagination somewhat. But the Smoke That Thunders is a really good name, I think, for Victoria Falls. And we actually saw people, I didn't get a photo of them, but here's a representation of people who were swimming right above the falls. Apparently there are pockets in the rock and they felt safe enough, but we thought they were crazy and did not do that. Do not do this at home. Something else that Overseas Adventure Travel does is the home-hosted visit. So in Victoria Falls, we were able to, there were 5 of us in our group, go to have dinner with a Zimbabwean family. So we were hosted by Linda Way, who's here, a stay-at-home mom, and her husband Marshall, who works in human resources at a big hotel in Victoria Falls. Their 2 nieces were staying with them, twin nieces, both in nursing school. That's common in Africa that nieces stay with aunts and uncles when they're about this age. But just a lovely family, had a tour of their home, had a nice visit, and some really great food. We had lentil curry with rice, excuse me. Lentil curry with rice, beef stew over polenta. They're big on greens, excuse me, which they called kale. I think it was more like chard, and some cooked squash. So a really nice evening. Ice cream for dessert, vanilla. As we were leaving, there were Cape buffalo wandering in the neighborhood, which was just something you don't see every day, but perhaps the most dangerous animal in Africa. People were out walking their dogs, and there were Cape buffalo in the next street. So don't see that in suburbia, but there they were. Towards the very end of our trip, we were able to visit an elephant sanctuary where orphaned and otherwise problematic, I'll say, elephants are taken care of by charity. And so a lot of these animals, there were only about 11 elephants there, but some of them had been in the elephant expedition business before, so elephant back tours, which are no longer done. Animals from that program were placed under the care of the Wild Horizons Elephant Sanctuary. So we were able to visit with these individuals up close and personal, feed them some special pellets, etc. So it was a really nice way to be up close and personal with elephants. There was one individual who decided to go join a wild herd. So these animals are outside, they do their own thing. Wild elephants are in the area too, and one of the elephants under care at this facility decided to join a wild herd. So they're keeping an eye on her to see how she does, but otherwise they do rely on humans. I have a special bond with Kariba, this 21-year-old female I got to feed, because if you look at her wrinkles and then you look at mine, I think there's some affinity there. So she and I bonded. Finally, when we were leaving Zimbabwe, we were able to do a sunset cruise on the Zambezi and listen to some marimba music, which is what you were hearing earlier, a CD of these guys performing, and had a nice candlelight dinner to boot. So that was our Zimbabwe experience. It was wonderful. And I'm going to turn it over to Kathy for Zambia, and you'll see me later for Cape Town.
You want to stand up and rest your butts for a minute? Okay. So I get this over with. All right. This thing is called a kitenge, and it's used for headgear, skirt gear, Boy Scout sash gear, off the shoulder menswear. But I can't get my glasses on, and I can't see Jack with them. So here we go. Okay, when we would fly on those little planes I showed you earlier, that's what the airport always looked like when we landed in a country. Yeah. This, and the restroom is right there off to the side. It's a little tent. I'll never remember to use this. So over there, it's a piece of canvas with a outdoor toilet in it. You had to be pretty desperate, but we were when we got off those little planes. And it was quite a drive to our camp, so it was dark when we were getting there, and you can't see it very well, but that is a serval cat, which was a very rare sighting according to our guides. They can see it, and it's the only good thing that's not the earth. It's a smart group. Okay. That's too many things to hold. Okay, now, Linda, you said I just hit the down button. On the left, every time you would come back to camp at night after your nighttime game drive, you would have they did that always. They were a very singing, dancing group of people. They were so warm and so lovely, and no matter how late we got back, the entire staff of the camp was there to sing and welcome us back. That is the view from Albert's and my tent at Kafue National Park. That down the side. Linda didn't use it. And it's her pointer right there. That is a hippo trail leading down into the Kafue River. I think it's the Kafue River.
What kind of noises do hippos make?
Can you guys imitate a hippo?
I don't remember.
Basically,
Very,
bathroom
very
noises.
deep.
Okay, Rick says basically bathroom noises. Use your imagination. Just don't do it out loud. Okay, in all but the camps in Botswana, most of the staff was male. In this camp in Kafue, we had a female, I'm going to call her a park ranger kind of a person, Doreen. She was, it's apparently very uncommon to have a female in a position like this, but we had a cultural program at one point, and she explained to us about the bride dowry, which I think Rick's going to talk about later, so I'm not, are you?
Only a wee bit, so.
Well, it's good. The bride's father asks the prospective groom for cows. Cows are currency. I'm not going to go into that. And there's Albert and Rick getting fitted with their tangays. The same ones. Well, no, Albert's got a different one on. Anyway, the tour company gave all of us a giant piece of cloth. This is the same piece of cloth that they're all wearing. These are the different ways they wear it. Oops. That is a tsetse. Oh, sorry. Zambia was the only place we went where tsetse flies were. They say tsetse flies. We say tsetse flies. Were an issue. We had to get. What shots did we get before we? Nothing for tsetse flies. Okay, we got malaria and all kinds of stuff. But that's one of our guides back there. When you walked in, did you notice the smoking thing on the side of the door? When you walked in, there was a tin can that was wafting malodorous stuff as you came in. That was elephant dung. And that's what he's doing on the back of our vehicle before we leave. He put a big old hunk of elephant dung in there and he lighted it. Because tsetse flies don't like elephant dung. That's a
Burning elephant dung.
burning elephant dung. I don't think they care if it's not burning. That's what it looks like.
Looks like bread, I'd probably.
Yes, but be very, very careful. When someone offers you a sandwich in Zambia, be careful. So that's what it looks like on the back of the truck, and that's what it looks like out in the yard when you leave again. It's got many wonderful, healthful qualities, which I think Rick is going to talk about. Yes. These are just some of the animals we saw in Zambia. We saw a sounder of warthogs. We saw a puku, which is a kind of antelope, a roan antelope. The roan antelope, if I'm remembering correctly, is fairly rare. Yes? Chihuahua. Okay, we saw an American fish eagle, and you're going to see them in action later in the program. That is the national bird of Zambia. There's a crocodile, and there's a civet cat at the bottom, which is also apparently a very rare sighting. They kept telling us about all the rare things we were seeing because we never saw a leopard. We weren't fooled. This is the general. All the animals were given names by the guides. Apparently they see the same animals over and over and they can recognize them. This guy is called the general. This is Savannah, who was trying to seduce the general. Apparently she had seduced him a number of times, but he was tired that day. But, okay, this is rated X. Be ready. And he's just going, I have a headache. But wait, there's more. Or there's not. Eventually, he gave in, you know, the male of the species. He just couldn't resist her for very much longer, so. And we were right there in our vehicle. There were three safari vehicles kind of in a circle around this. And, you know, she kept at him, boy, until he gave in.
And she'd been doing it for 6 or 7 days.
6 or 7 days, which is why he was tired, because apparently this is sort of kind of a monogamous couple, at least for this season anyway. Yeah. We went on a special outing to see white rhinos. The rhinos are heavily poached, and now they are almost all of them in a preserve that is guarded with heavily armed guards 24/7, 365 days a year. You cannot just walk out and see a rhino. You've got to pay some money that goes toward the thing, and they take you and they let you walk out and see them. There aren't very many of them. Do any of you remember how many there were?
They had 10.
10. They had 10 in this preserve. Most of the poaching comes from people in Asia who give money to the locals to poach the horns. We were told that one rhino horn, once it's all broken down, could bring as much as $1 million.
Whoa.
So it's, for people who are very poor, it's tempting. However, somebody will tell me more about that later. There's the guard on the left. They have these submachine, I don't know anything about guns, but that looks pretty lethal to me. And that's the male rhino. These are white rhinos. They're also black rhinos. But these are white. They look black to me, but they're white. My favorite animal is the giraffe. So there you go. There's I'm assuming a mother and a baby. And I'm done. Botswana.
Hello? Yes. Okay. We flew we always went back to, what's it called? Victoria Falls, Livingston Airport. And from there, we flew over to Chobe. And after I showed her how to use this, I'm not using it. So anyway, we flew there and then took a little flight over to Kasane. And then from Kasane, we took a bus over to Chobe National Park. And since I've got the map up, I'm going to show you, eventually, we flew over to the Okavango Delta here. And the Okavango Delta, which you may or may not have ever heard of, is the world's largest interior delta. Not indoor, but oh well, big house. And then while we were in the Okavango Delta, we drove up and went over to a national park in Namibia here, and that was only part of a day. So that's where Namibia was in. That was our game drive there. And the Okavango Delta most deltas are at the mouth of a river, and this is, I guess, the Okavango River. And where does it empty into? No ocean. Can anyone tell me?
Okavango Delta,
Just a
right
desert.
No, but where does it go?
there. It doesn't go anywhere.
It does.
Into
It
the
goes
ground.
into the Kalahari Desert.
Yeah.
See, Steve didn't know that. Okay, this was the road signs coming in, and there's all the rules for the park. And the park, the Chobe National Park, has very limited hours, and at night it closes down, and if you are found in the park after hours, you are probably thought to be a poacher, and you could be shot. And then telenovelas are even in Botswana. Just as we entered the park, there they were, 12 lionesses hanging out. And that was our camp. It was Baobab. And these were great little, those are actually tents. And these actually they had ceiling fans. And we were delighted, really delighted. And they also had floor fans there. And a particular feature that our tent had was a rat that ate all my emergency. It just loved it. Even though the packages were all sealed and everything, it just thought, no, just what I need. A giraffe eating capers. That is a caper bush. And then over here, we were very lucky to see this Goliath heron with its wings all spread out like that, drying them out, as we often see our turkey vultures here doing. And as always, the guide said, "Oh, you're really lucky to see that. No one else has ever seen that before." Here we saw our first big herds of Cape buffalo. And as has been mentioned, they are considered the most dangerous because they're totally unpredictable. They don't know if they're going to charge, what they're going to do. And of course, we got stories of them almost turning over one of the safari vehicles. Zebras, these are actually in Namibia, because this is the Chobe River right here, and that's Namibia on that side. And so we've got the zebras there, and I just saw somewhere that there is a huge zebra migration in the Kalahari Desert during rainy season. Have you heard that before? See, something new here. Okay. This is just to show you a typical game drive we did. And that's showing all the miles. The camp we were staying at was right about here. And so we drove into the entrance here and then drove there and had a picnic here. And they told us, be really careful of the monkeys, they will steal your food.
Hey, want to try that again? Who has a half an apple?
You go sit there holding an apple.
What's that?
Holding apples and we're gonna.
And one of our members was laughing and pointing at the monkey up in the tree having stolen someone else's apple. And she was holding her apple up like this, and the monkey ran up her front.
Yes.
I was
And
standing
just-
directly behind her, and this monkey came flying out of the tree, and all I could see was this thing coming at her face with his hands out, and we were screaming, "Oh my God, it's gonna eat her face!" And he just grabbed the apple out of her hand and ran back up in the tree. It was scary.
And then you were so lucky because that never happened to anyone else.
That was another rare sight. No leopards.
This was our last cabin, which had air conditioning. And it was on the Shakaway River right there in the Okavango Delta. And there were signs like this.
I thought hippos were the most dangerous animal in Africa.
Well,
The guys.
debate it with the guys, okay? Okay, we got in the boat and went up and saw this thing. And tell us about it, Linda.
Well, those are white-fronted bee eaters. We saw several species of bee eaters. That particular one there is called white-fronted bee eater. They actually eat bees, and they burrow in riverbanks. So that is a series of white-fronted bee eater burrows. Say that fast 5 times.
Okay, and then I said we did a day trip over to Namibia, and that was crossing. We had to walk from, about a quarter of a mile
Probably.
from the Botswana exit to the Namibia entrance, and vice versa on the way back. And that was just a pretty jacaranda tree that we figured y'all want to see. Okay, I think Rick counted 22 hippos or so in this bloat or crash. Wouldn't you love to just make up collective nouns? Our guides told us that, and this is a family of ostriches, and they told us that last week there were 6 babies and that they would be lucky if one of them made it to adulthood. The main predator is the martial eagle, and we did have a shot in Zimbabwe of a martial eagle sitting in a tree looking down as mom and dad are walking very carefully with the chicks hiding beneath them. But that would have been too much fun to show you that. These are papyrus. And that is a monitor lizard, about 6 foot or so. This all on the Shakaway River. And another one of the inhabitants there. Okay, this is our guide 9. And we are not in a national park here, or a state park. And that's why this was allowed.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Here it is. The boat's coming, let's see who
Those are the African fish eagle. And they have clearly trained them or not. Maybe the birds trained the guides.
Okay.
All right, well, continuing on our journey, we flew into Cape Town, South Africa, which was a lovely place for the most part, and we met this lovely man, our friend Tabby, who Kathy was describing earlier as having had a really rough time during the COVID pandemic making ends meet. But very knowledgeable, friendly, loved having him with us for the 3-ish days we were in Cape Town. It was truly a city of contrasts. Beautiful areas like the river, waterfront here, very affluent. And then there were also these huge homeless camps. Our hotel was quite nice, in a very nice part of town, but literally the next block over was a huge homeless camp. And there was a police presence there. If we wanted to go into that area, there's a restaurant there that was a possibility with authentic African food, and we were told to make sure we had a police escort. We were also advised what streets to walk on and which streets not to walk on if we were by ourselves. So a huge homelessness problem for a variety of reasons, economic, inavailability of jobs, and also there's a huge drug problem in South Africa. And so that feeds into the whole problem of homelessness, unfortunately. But on the more pleasant side, we were able to visit Table Mountain, which forms the backdrop of Cape Town. A nice cable car that goes up to the top. It rotates, so it was quite fun to ride that up to the top and take in the scenery. A lot of hikers also hiked to the top. And once we were there, we had a nice tour of this really interesting vegetation. It's called Fynbos, Fynbos, which in Afrikaans means fine bush. So it's a shrubland, a lot of heath plants, composites, protea, which you'll see, but it's my new favorite vegetation type, I think, in all the world. It's all sandstone too, by the way, and just lovely. So here's an example of some of the vegetation in this Fynbos. A lot in flower, and it was just quite lovely. I meant to mention a minute ago, it's called Table Mountain because it's a mesa. It's about 2 miles long, so shaped like a table. And also there's fog that forms on top of the mountain quite frequently, like a tablecloth. And the legend is that there is the devil who lives at Devil's Head, one of the mountains, and then a pirate who hangs out off the coast, and they have a smoking contest. So when the tablecloth comes out, it's symbolic of the smoking contest between the pirate and the devil. This vegetation is very limited. There are 6 floral kingdoms in the world, so biogeographic regions, and you see the tiny, tiny, tiny little Cape biotic or floral kingdom, which is the richest in the world. It has the highest diversity per unit of measure, yet it is by far the tiniest. So really interesting to me as a plant person. And a lot of this diversity was shown off at Kirstenbosch National Botanical Garden, which has been in existence since 1913, as I recall, and it highlights the native plants of South Africa. Just a beautiful setting. As you can see, lots in flower, most of it native vegetation. And my favorites were these proteas. And protea is an ancient species taxonomically. It's sort of like a composite in the way it grows. It grows in these heads of individual flowers. In fact, the national flower of South Africa is the last one here. So there are these bracts that subtend these flower heads, and they're just lovely. Also called sugar bush.
How big were they?
Most of them were shrub high. Well, some of them are, small, and then shrub height. Some are trees. The flowers, like that last one there, is probably yay big. And then some of these others are much smaller. But known as sugar bush because they're full of nectar. There are no hummingbirds in the eastern hemisphere, only in the western hemisphere, but the sugar birds are very close. Sugar birds and also sunbirds, and we saw sunbirds nectaring on these flowers. Just gorgeous. My cell phone, though, would not capture that very well, so didn't even try. The next day we were able to drive down the west coast, which is just beautiful. This is not a photo of False Bay, but False Bay is a little farther down. You may have heard of False Bay if you've watched the documentary My Octopus Teacher. Has anyone? So that was filmed on the west coast near the Cape of Good Hope in False Bay. But a lovely drive. We stopped at the Cape of Good Hope. This is some of our tour group. It was very windy, as you might be able to tell. It's the southwesternmost point in Africa, but not the southernmost. So the Cape of Good Hope, if you were sailing south along the west coast, is the point at which you start to go around the tip. But there is another cape, Agulhas, which is a little bit farther south, the southernmost part. But it was a really interesting day there, a fun place to visit. And we were able to see it from various angles, went up to a lighthouse for a good view, and as you can see, the weather just changed dramatically. The Cape of Good Hope was initially named by the first European to navigate there, the Cape of Storms, and this, I think, exemplifies why storms just pop up and go away in a nanosecond, it seems. And it was the King of Portugal who actually renamed it Cape of Good Hope because it offered good hope to sailors that they could actually reach India for the spices that were there over sea, not over land. So Cape of Good Hope is named for that reason.
What month were you there?
We were there in September. We left here in September and returned in early October. So yeah, and it was quite chilly in South Africa compared to the rest of Africa. We're quite a way south of the Tropic of Capricorn. So near the Cape of Good Hope, but on it actually you should say East Cape, we're heading back east now, is Simontown, a beautiful town that has both British and Dutch influence. And there's a penguin colony there. It seemed really strange to see these, quintessential African animals like lions and elephants and hippos and rhinos and all the rest, and also penguins. But, we're pretty far south at this point. So these are African penguins. There are 13 colonies of African penguins in Africa that stretch from Namibia all the way down through South Africa. And they're just the cutest things ever. You can see they really do model, and we had a nice view of these from a boardwalk. Everyone who was there was smiling. You cannot watch penguins and not smile, I've decided. So they were just charming. Lots of nice shots. So they get to be about 20 inches tall and waddle around and give birth to young, and they're monogamous, and they're just wonderful, wonderful creatures.
Is that sand or snow?
That is sand. It was a white sand beach. This is Boulders Beach, if I back up here a minute. Called Boulders Beach because of the granite boulders, but just really nice pale white sand at Simontown. Our waddler. I will take a lot of photos of Albert Bork for reasons unknown to me, but I do. So we went to Stellenbosch, which is a town just east of Cape Town. Dutch town. It was founded back in the late 1600s, not Dutch architecture, etc. But the main reason for going there was to sample wine. We visited 3 wineries, but by the 3rd one we were pretty well tanked, and so we didn't really drink anymore. But we had a nice lunch and a nice tasting. So we like the whites better than the reds, but that's the way that went. Pardon me, I am not sick, I promise you. I've had post-nasal drip since November, so that may be TMI, but I'm not infecting you guys with anything. I was coughing. So this is a neighborhood in Cape Town that has its roots back in the slave trade days. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Dutch who inhabited this area brought in slaves from India, from Sri Lanka, from Indonesia, and from Malaysia. So this is known as Cape Malay. This Bo-Kap neighborhood is called Cape Malay, even though people who live there now were not necessarily Malaysian. But this very colorful architecture remains. It's a Muslim community, and so we heard the noontime call to prayer, went there for lunch, and had a really nice Malaysian meal. a little bit of Easter egg color, I guess, in the middle of Cape Town. So a really nice day there, loved it. And Rick is gonna wrap up with some, as you can see, concluding remarks.
I know we're running a little late, and they were smart enough not to give me much to talk about.
Can you speak up, please?
I'll try. Has this thing
I don't know, there's a button.
been
There's a
resurrected?
Try it.
Does it work now?
No.
Okay. So how safe is it to travel to South Africa? Well, I had a little preface of the safety in line on the flight to Johannesburg. And I met a guy right behind me who was going back home to Johannesburg. And I asked him, I said, heard about the crime there. Is it real? All he did was roll up his shirt sleeve and show me his gunshot wounds. Yeah. He said he was carjacked. He gave him the car and they shot him anyway. I'd already bought my ticket, so I was committed. I was going to go. But when you get to Johannesburg, they tell you specifically, do not go out at night. Don't do it. So when we got in Johannesburg during the day tours, there was barbed wire, razor wire, and the affluent communities had electrical fences. The real problem is the high unemployment. In South Africa, the blacks' unemployment is 26%. Does anyone want to venture a guess what the unemployment rate is in Zimbabwe?
75.
Higher. It's 95%. And during COVID, it was 100%. But 95%. So most of the people just do subsistence farming. So South Africa is more affluent. Zimbabwe, massive unemployment, just like Zambia. And there's a mass migration from those countries into South Africa. And the South Africans are not happy about that at all. There's even talk of building a wall and making Zimbabwe pay for it. We had one of the people in our tour group that was mugged. She was mugged in Cape Town. And we had split up into smaller groups. The guide had told us which streets are safe, which to avoid. And unfortunately, their group deviated, got into one of the unrecommended streets. And she was wearing a gold pendant. And they snatched it. And fortunately for her, they dropped it as they turned to run, and she got it back. But you have to be careful. Our guides also tell you, don't use an ATM. Just don't do it. You become an immediate target if you do that. So the other thing is, what's it like to enter a country that is anywhere from 80 to 99.5% black? And I was kind of wondering about that, and I talked to our guide about it as well. And he said that the rural areas, there's almost no racism at all. And that was our experience. These people were happy, friendly, engaging, even though they knew all about colonialism, the horrors, they were just fine. And that was our experience. He said, though, that when you get into metropolitan areas, it's not quite as good. But he told me that the people that are the most racist of all are the politicians. kind of a surprise. But they have to deal with all these other countries, including some big ones that call theirs a little shithole country. And he said that's a real problem within the government. Now, we noticed a big difference in those countries that had been colonized and those that were just a protectorate. So,
What's the difference?
all right, but when it was colonized, then the European nation came in and they wanted to change. They wanted to get the country with their religion, they were going to use their economic system, and they were going to impose the labor force on their will. So they really kind of go in there and try to squash the native culture and replace it with their own. So, and this is an example. This is in Zimbabwe, and every person in the camp was male. Cooks, the guys doing the laundry, all male. We went to Zambia, and one woman in all the camps we went to. Everyone else was male. So Botswana was different. Botswana had been a protectorate. And in a protectorate, the European country would come in and say, well, we'll protect you and not let any of the other European countries come in. But they didn't try to change their culture at all. And I talked with the guide, and he says that, Native African culture, men and women were far more equal. And they actually had women that were tribe leaders, women witch doctors. So they had places of importance in most of the societies. So this is staff in Botswana, and these aren't just the cooks. These were the people running the place. The guys were actually in a subservient role. This was our pilot, by far the most professional pilot we had on any of these bush pilot trips. You don't even see many women pilots in our country. So I was talking with Manuel, and he says that most of the difference between a colony and a protectorate is in the treatment of women. And a lot of that was because of the religion. The colonists, the Europeans brought in the Middle Eastern religions like Islam and Christianity, which kind of drove that. So I want to talk for a moment about poaching. In most of these countries, this animal tourism is number 2. So it's a big, big industry and a lot of money. So they really had to crack down on poaching. And of course, they started off with bigger and bigger fines. It did nothing. So, they'll come to these natives that live close to the national park, give them $100 and go tell them to go shoot a rhino for them. So they'd catch just a poor native, and it wasn't making any kind of effect at all on the poaching, which led to the more draconian measures of shoot to kill. So in Zimbabwe, if someone is in the park and suspected of being a poacher, you can shoot to kill, because most of the time they have automatic weapons as well. But they must have a gun. If you shoot somebody and they don't have a gun, you go to trial. But in Zambia, like Albert said, if you're caught in that national park after hours, shoot to kill, no questions. You don't have to have a gun. If you're in the park, they're going to shoot you. But there's been a dramatic fall in the poaching just for that reason alone. Back to the dung. So, you know, they love elephant dung. They sniff it, they smell it, they smoke it, they make tea with it, they put it in their food. And yeah, and I asked my guide, you know, I don't understand. What's the magic of elephant dung? He says, oh, it's simple. The elephants go all day long eating all these wonderful herbs, and it's concentrated in their poop. And sure enough, today I found that there's a South African gin that's an award-winning gin made with elephant dung. And it's called Inluve, which is Zulu for elephant. Now, I have to tell you the story of the burning dung outside the door. I brought this back for you guys at great personal risk. Well, there are some appetizers in the bag. So I was at the elephant preserve and got some help, because if you get one a little too fresh, it doesn't burn. And if you get one that's a little too old, it won't smoke properly. So they help me pick out just the right.
The Goldilocks would be.
Yeah. So I put it in a 2-gallon Ziploc bag and in my suitcase. And that was a mistake. So Albert had 2 more Ziplocs. I put 3 Ziploc bags around that stuff, and it's still stank. So I put it in my suitcase on the trip home, and after 3 weeks, I think my clothing overpowered it, and it went through. And we flew all the way back to Newark, and I was so naive. I got back in there, and there's some baggage claim. There was, you know, a guard with a dog. And he's to sniff out agricultural stuff. Yes. So I made friends with the dog. And he sniffed my backpack, and I was good. He left, my bag showed up, and I took off. And that dog whipped his head around to look at me as I left with that thing. But that's how you got the elephant dog out. So, I want to talk a little bit about African humor. They call a campfire African TV. The yellow-billed hornbill is called the flying banana. The ruts on those roads are just awful, and that's called the African massage. And then there's the African salute, and another variation of the African salute. The water is so cold in Cape Town, you know, there's penguins there. The locals joke, you dive in a man and come out a boy. And now, I do have to end by talking about my one great disappointment of the trip. Yeah, this is my first trip ever to the Southern Hemisphere, and I wanted to see the water swirl. What a disappointment. Everywhere we went, they had these nasty toilets that went straight down, and there was no swirling at all. But we recently came back from a trip to Ecuador. And Ecuador, right on the equator. Which way is it going to swirl? Plus, you know, on the equator, the Earth is spinning its fastest, and how fast is it going to swirl in the toilet? Well, the answers to these questions and the video will be in our next talk.